She was gone before the fire died. The last log had collapsed into a bed of incandescent embers, pulsing softly in the great hearth of the king's private chambers. Ilara moved through the pre-dawn chill with the economy of a ghost, her bare feet silent on the cold flagstones. She had spent the winter here, a prisoner of duty and a brutal black-lunged sickness that had tried to claim this northern pack. She had fought it with winterthorn and foxglove, with poultices and bitter teas, with hands that had been scrubbed raw and a will that had been forged in colder places than this. She had won. The last of the fevered children now slept soundly in the longhouse, their breathing even and deep. The king's best hunters, who had been coughing up blood only a moon ago, were already planning the spring hunt. Her debt sanctuary through the worst of the blizzards was paid. She owned little: a leather satchel holding dried herbs, a change of linen, a skinning knife with a handle of worn birchwood. She rolled her sleeping pelt, the coarse wool, a familiar weight against her back. She did not look at the heavy chair by the fire where the alpha King Kalen had sat night after night, watching her work. He had been a silent, brooding statue of a man, his presence a constant pressure against her senses. He never commanded, never demanded. He simply observed, his stillness more unnerving than any alpha's roar. In all the months she had spent within the suffocating proximity of his power, he had spoken to her perhaps 100 words, most of them clipped necessities. More bandages. The fever is higher. This one is not breathing. And she had answered with the same brutal efficiency. Boil the water. Hold him down. He will breathe. They had existed in a state of suspended conflict. Two forces of equal and opposite will, bound by the crisis that had laid his people low. Now, the crisis was over. The silence in the keep was no longer the strained quiet of a sick room, but the placid emptiness of recovery. She was no longer needed. She had known this moment would come. On-megas like her, unbonded and itinerant, were anomalies, useful in disaster and forgotten in peace. To stay was to invite speculation, to risk becoming a curiosity, a prize, or a threat. The road did not ask questions. She paused at the great oak table that dominated the center of the room. It was scarred with the history of his line, gouged by daggers and stained by spilled wine. His scent clung to the wood, a clean, sharp fragrance of pine and cold stone that had become as familiar to her as the smell of her own herbs. For a moment, her resolve wavered. She remembered the night he had brought her food himself, a bowl of stew, setting it on this table without a word when she had been too exhausted to stand. She remembered the way he had held a dying elder's hand, his large, calloused palm, gentle, his face a mask of iron control, as the old man's life had slipped away. She had seen the king, but she had also seen the man trapped inside the crown. It was the man she was running from. From a small oilskin pouch at her belt, she took what she had saved. It was a single, perfect thing, something she had found on her first and only walk in the Wolf's Wood before the worst of the snows had trapped them all. She set it down in the very center of the table, directly in the space where the faint morning light from the high, unshuttered window would strike first. The sound of something small and delicate being set down carefully on wood. It looked impossibly fragile against the dark, brutalist timber, a declaration and a farewell in one silent gesture. She did not allow herself a second look. She turned, slipped through the heavy chamber door, and was gone. The corridors were empty. The great hall was a cavern of sleeping hounds and banked fires. The main gate was barred, but a smaller postern gate used by the servants was not. She slipped the bolt, the oiled metal making only the faintest sigh, and stepped out into the biting air of the false dawn. The snow crunched under her boots. She did not look back. Kalen woke to the absence of a sound he hadn't realized he'd been listening for. For months, the first thing he heard upon waking was the soft, rhythmic scrape of Alara's mortar and pestle, the gentle clink of glass vials, the rustle of dried leaves. Now there was only silence. A deep, hollow silence that the stone walls seemed to amplify. His eyes opened. The fire was a bed of gray ash with a single winking ember at its heart. The room was cold and empty. Her sleeping pelt was gone from its place by the hearth. Her satchel of remedies was gone from the small table where she worked. A cold dread, unfamiliar and sharp, coiled in his gut. He rose from his bed, the furs pooling around his feet. He was a king. He was not accustomed to being left. People begged to enter his service. They wept when dismissed. They did not simply vanish before the sun was up. He strode to the table, his mind racing through possibilities. Had someone threatened her? Had one of the pack lords, resentful of an Omega's authority, driven her out? Then he saw it. Lying in a precise patch of nascent sunlight, it seemed to gather all the light in the room to itself. It was a single winterthorn blossom, pressed and preserved, 5 white petals, so pale they were almost translucent, with a faint blush of blood red at their heart. It was flawless. Winterthorn was the healer's plant, its root a balm for fever, its leaves a poultice for wounds. But the flower, was something else entirely. It bloomed for a single day, in the deepest cold of winter, a defiant miracle against the frost. Tradition, old as the mountains themselves, gave the blossom a singular, immutable meaning. It was the Omega's challenge, a formal declaration of courtship, issued to an alpha. It was a relic of an older time, a custom so archaic it was spoken of only in tales. It was an assertion of choice of power from the one who was supposed to have none. It was an act of profound, unthinkable audacity, and it was never, ever done to a king. He stood frozen, the world narrowing to that one impossible object. She had taken no coin. She had asked for no reward for the lives she had saved. She had simply healed his people, and then in the quiet of the dawn, she had placed a challenge on his table and walked away. It was not a plea, it was not a proposal, it was a statement. I am your equal, I see you, and I am leaving. He understood, with a clarity that felt like a physical blow, that she had never intended for him to accept. The challenge was the farewell. It was her way of seizing the narrative, of ensuring she was not the grateful Omega healer scurrying away, but the one who set the terms of her own departure. She had looked at a king and refused to be diminished. She had witnessed the man inside the crown and then walked out the door as if he were any other man. It was the most profound act of disrespect he had ever been shown, and the most honest. Silence, a low growl rumbled in his chest. An involuntary sound of possession and fury and something else, something he refused to name. He turned from the table, his movements sharp and decisive. He did not call his guard. He did not wake the pack. He dressed in durable leathers, strapped a long knife to his thigh, and slung a heavy cloak over his shoulders. He strode from his chambers, his boots echoing in the silent keep. In the stables, he saddled his own horse, a great black stallion that snorted plumes of steam in the cold. He rode out from the postern gate she had used, the rising sun at his back, chasing the faint track she had left in the thin layer of new snow. He was not a king retrieving a subject. He was an alpha answering a challenge. He remembered the day she arrived. She had come with the first blizzard, a lone figure walking out of the swirling white, her face chapped raw by the wind. The guards had thought her a beggar. He had seen her from the battlements, a small, stubborn shape, moving against the storm. They had brought her to the great hall, dripping meltwater onto the stones. She had not bowed. She had stood before his throne, her pack on her back, and met his gaze without flinching. Her eyes were the color of moss in deep forest, startlingly clear and unnervously direct. "The sickness will be at your gates by the next moon," she had said, her voice low and steady. "It travels with the northern winds this year. I can stop it. I ask for shelter until the thaw." His pack lords had scoffed. An Omega healer, a transient? But he had seen the truth in her stillness, the absolute lack of supplication in her posture. She was not asking for a favor. She was offering a trade. He had seen the fine tremor in her hands, the exhaustion deep in her bones, but her will was a straight, unbending line. He had agreed, and she had been right. The sickness had come, swift and brutal, and she had met it head on, a tireless whirlwind of knowledge and grim determination. She had saved them. And in doing so, she had worked her way under his skin like a splinter of ice, a constant cold ache of awareness. He had found himself watching the way her hands moved, so sure and precise, as she ground herbs or stitched a wound. He had learned the subtle shifts in her scent, chamomile and clean linen when she was calm, a sharp tang of ozone when she was angry or afraid. He had grown accustomed to her presence in his chambers, a quiet, formidable force that had pushed back the crushing loneliness of his station without ever trying to, and he had let her. That was the most damning part. He had let her see the cracks in his armor. He had let her witness his exhaustion, his fear for his people. He had allowed a silence to grow between them that was more intimate than any conversation. And now she was gone. The tracks were easy to follow at first, a single set of prints heading east, toward the Thistlewood Pass. She was moving with purpose, her stride long and even. She was not fleeing in panic. She was making a journey. He urged his stallion on, the powerful animal eating up the miles. The sun climbed higher, casting long, stark shadows across the snow-dusted landscape. The cold was a living thing, seeping into his cloak, biting at any exposed skin. He barely felt it. A cold fury was burning inside him, a feeling so potent it was almost clarifying. How dare she? How dare she walk into his life, anchor herself to the very center of it, and then simply leave, leaving behind a symbol that would force him to either follow or be shamed. For an alpha, to ignore such a challenge was to admit the Omega was his superior, that she had bested him. It was a masterful, viciously intelligent move. She had left him no choice. He would find her. And then he did not know. The thought trailed off into a formless void. He had always known what to do in battle, in politics, in judgment. His path had always been clear. But with her, he was walking in a fog, guided only by a primal, undeniable pull. He was the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories, and a slip of an Omega healer had him on a leash, pulling him across his own lands. The thought was maddening and exhilarating. Ilara did not need to look back to know he was coming. She could feel it, a prickling awareness on her skin, a thrumming in the air that was more than just the wind. She had known he would follow. The winter thorn blossom was not just a symbol, it was a goad. An alpha of his pride could not ignore it. To do so would be a concession of defeat. She knew he was incapable of making. She had counted on his pride. It was the only part of him she was certain she understood. She moved through the skeletal trees of the thistlewood, her pace steady. She was not a frightened doe running from a wolf. She was a rival, setting the terms of engagement on her own ground. The wilderness was her sanctuary, the one place her omega status was an asset, not a liability. Here, her heightened senses, her innate connection to the rhythms of the natural world, gave her an advantage. She could read the land, smell the coming weather, find sustenance where others would starve. Here she was not less than an alpha. She was simply different, more attuned, more aware. She had spent her life being underestimated. Healers were valued, but omega healers were treated with a kind of gentle condescension. They were seen as nurturing, passive, their skills a product of instinct rather than intellect. No one ever saw the iron discipline it took, the years of study, the cold, clinical precision required to face down death every day. No one saw the loneliness of it, to be surrounded by the suffering of others, to be the vessel for their hopes and fears, and to have no one to turn to herself. At Kalen's side, she had felt a strange and terrifying kinship. He was as isolated by his power as she was by her purpose. She had seen the profound loneliness in his eyes, in the deep hours of the night, when another body had grown cold under her hands, and he had simply stood there, a silent witness to her failure. He had not offered empty comfort. He had not tried to manage her grief. He had simply shared the weight of it, his presence a solid, unmoving anchor in the storm. That shared silence had forged a bond she could not afford, a bond that would, in the end, become a cage. So, she had run, and she had left the flower as both a final, defiant truth and a desperate prayer that he would be angry enough to let her go for good. Now, feeling the vibration of his pursuit through the soles of her boots, she suspected she had badly miscalculated. He was not coming to release her. He was coming to claim what the challenge had offered. The sky was darkening, the clouds gathering in bruised purple masses along the western peaks. A storm was coming, a late winter squall, mean and fast. She needed shelter. She knew this area. There was a series of shallow caves in a granite outcrop a few miles ahead near a frozen creek. She quickened her pace, the cold air burning in her lungs. The feeling of being pursued intensified. No longer a distant hum, but a palpable pressure at her back. He was closing the distance. She could smell him on the wind now, pine and cold stone, and the sharp metallic scent of his singular focus. She scrambled up the rocky incline, her fingers finding holds in the frozen stone. She found the cave she was looking for, a narrow opening partially obscured by a curtain of icicles. It was not large, but it was dry and out of the wind. She slipped inside, dropping her pack to the floor. She had just begun to gather the few dry twigs and pieces of bark from the back of the cave when a shadow fell across the entrance. He was there. He did not duck to enter, but stood framed in the opening, a dark, imposing silhouette against the gray, failing light. His stallion stood patiently behind him, its breath pluming in the air. He did not look winded. He looked inevitable. He took a step inside, and the small space seemed to shrink, the air growing thick and heavy. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the rising howl of the wind outside. Then he slowly pulled a gloved hand from beneath his cloak. He was holding the winter thorn blossom. It lay on his palm, impossibly delicate against the scarred black leather. "Explain this," he said. His voice was not a command. It was a low, quiet demand for a truth he already knew. She met his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. She would not let him see her fear. "There is nothing to explain," she replied, her own voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. "It is what it is." A flicker of something frustration, perhaps, or grudging respect crossed his face. He took another step closer. She could feel the heat coming off his body, a stark contrast to the biting cold of the cave. "You saved my people," he said, his voice dropping even lower, a gravelly rumble that vibrated to the stone floor. "And you leave this on my table. A challenge, an insult, a claim. You think you can put a leash on a king and then simply walk away?" "I think," she said, her chin lifting, "that I can leave when my work is done. I owed you my skill. I do not owe you myself." His eyes, the color of a winter sky before a storm, narrowed. He saw the gash then, a long, shallow tear in the sleeve of her tunic, the fabric darkened with blood. She had caught it on a sharp branch during her climb. Before she could react, he reached out his fingers, brushing the wound. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up her arm. His touch was not rough, but it was possessive, absolute. "You are injured." It was a flat statement of fact. She pulled her arm back instinctively. "It is nothing. Let me see it," he said, and there it was. The Alpha command, quiet but laced with the steel of his will, the part of her that was Omega recoiled, instinctively wanting to obey. But the part of her that was Alara, the part that had survived on its own for years, rebelled. No, the word hung in the air between them. Small and sharp. She had never denied him anything. She had never needed to. Their relationship had been one of unspoken, professional deference. This was new territory. A muscle feathered in his jaw. He looked from her defiant face to her injured arm, and a strange, complex battle seemed to war in his eyes. He wanted to force her. She could see it. The instinct was written in the rigid set of his shoulders, the tension in his hands, but he didn't. He took a half step back, breaking the charged space between them. The sound of a sharp, frustrated exhalation. He turned and began to build a fire with the kindling she had gathered, his movements precise and economical. The unspoken conflict had passed. He had wanted to command, and he had chosen not to. The choice was more terrifying than the command would have been. It meant he was seeing her not as a subject to be ordered, but as a territory to be won. The storm broke with a primal fury, a wall of wind and driving snow that sealed them in the cave. The fire Kalen had built crackled and spat, a small bastion of warmth and light against the roaring darkness. They sat on opposite sides of it, wrapped in a silence that was denser than any they had shared in the keep. Alara cleaned and bandaged her own arm, her movements practiced and efficient, acutely aware of his eyes following every gesture. He had not spoken again since she had refused him. He had unsaddled his horse, settling the great beast at the mouth of the cave where it acted as a further windbreak, and then he had taken up his vigil. He unpacked his own saddlebags, laying out a piece of dried meat and a small, hard wheel of cheese. He broke both in half and pushed her share across the stone floor toward her without a word. She ate, her hunger a dull ache that she had been ignoring. The food was tasteless in her mouth. The tension in the small space was a physical thing, a pressure against her skin. This was what she had tried to escape. This proximity, this suffocating awareness of him. He was a mountain, solid and unmoving, and she was a bird trapped in its shadow. Hours passed, the storm howled, the fire burned low. Kylan added another piece of wood. The flames, leaping up to cast his face in flickering light and shadow. The planes of his face were harsh, carved from granite and regret. She had seen him tired, she had seen him grieving, but she had never seen him like this, stripped of his crown and his purpose, left with only the raw, elemental nature of his own will. He was watching her, his gaze steady and unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet against the noise of the storm. "Where were you going?" The question was simple, direct. It was not an accusation. It was a genuine inquiry. It disarmed her more than any demand would have. "East," she said, her voice tight, "across the mountains. Before the spring melts, make the rivers impassable. And then," she shrugged, pulling her cloak tighter around her shoulders, "there are towns, sickness. There is always work. You would spend your life chasing death from other people's doors?" There was no judgment in his tone, only a kind of weary curiosity. "It is what I do," she said. "It is who I am." He was silent for a long time, staring into the flames. When he spoke again, his voice was so low she almost didn't hear it. "The keep is quiet, without the sound of your grinding stone." The words landed in the space between them with a soft, devastating weight. It was not a compliment. It was not a plea. It was a confession. An admission of the space she had carved out in his world, a space that was now an aching void. He was the king. Surrounded by his pack, his court, his guards, he should not be lonely. But he was high. She had heard it in the silence of his chambers, seen it in the way he stood on the battlements at night, a solitary figure staring out at the darkness. He was utterly, profoundly alone. And in that moment, she understood the true nature of the bond between them. She did not heal him. She did not save him. She witnessed him, and to be truly seen, for a man like Kalen, was a violation far more intimate than any touch. It was an undoing. The admission hung in the air, changing the very quality of the silence. It was no longer a silence of conflict, but one of shared, unwilling vulnerability. She saw him then not as the Alpha King, a man encased in a role so absolute it threatened to erase him completely, and she, in her fierce independence, was just as trapped, defined by her refusal to belong anywhere. They were two sides of the same solitary coin. "It is always quiet after a storm," she finally said, her voice softer than she intended. He looked at her then, a direct, searching gaze that held none of his earlier anger. It held something far more dangerous. Understanding. He had followed her, not just out of pride, but out of a desperate, instinctual need not to be left alone in that quiet again. It stripped away her defenses, leaving her raw and exposed. She had left the flower to end things on her own terms, to burn the bridge between them. She had not realized that for him, it was not an ending, but the first honest word spoken between them. The fire dipped, and in the sudden dimness, she felt the truth of her own heart. She had run, not because she didn't care for him, but because she did. Because the thought of staying, of softening, of allowing herself to need the quiet strength of his presence was more frightening than any wilderness or any sickness she had ever faced. To need him would be to give him a weapon that could destroy her. The storm passed with the dawn. A pale, watery light filtered into the cave, illuminating a world blanketed in fresh, pristine snow. The air was clean and cold and still. The silence of the morning was different from the silence of the night. It was peaceful, expectant. A beginning. Kalen was already awake, standing at the mouth of the cave, looking out at the transformed landscape. He turned as he heard her stir. The harsh lines of his face seemed to have softened in the new light. He had come to a decision during the long, dark hours. She could see it in the calm set of his shoulders. She rose and gathered her things, her movements stiff. Her heart was a cold knot of dread and anticipation. This was the moment of judgment. He would either force her to return, a prisoner of his will, or he would let her go, leaving them both with the ghost of what had passed between them. He walked back toward her, stopping just out of arm's reach. He no longer held the flower. He must have put it away somewhere safe. "The challenge stands," he said. His voice was calm, a simple statement of fact. She stared at him, confused. "What?" "The Winterthorn," he clarified. "It is a formal challenge. I have the right to answer." She had expected anger, command, even dismissal. She had not expected this. He was not rejecting her gesture. He was not ignoring it. He was accepting it. He was honoring the very tradition she had used as a weapon against him, turning her act of defiance into a legitimate negotiation between equals. He was playing her game by her rules. "You are a king," she whispered the words, feeling inadequate. "It is not a challenge. You are required to answer." "Perhaps not as a king," he conceded, a faint, almost imperceptible warmth entering his eyes. "But as an alpha, I am, and as a man, I choose to." He was giving her back the power she had tried to seize. He was offering her a choice when he could have simply taken it. "You wish for me to return with you," she stated, her mind reeling. "I wish for you to walk back to the keep at my side," he corrected her gently. "Not as my healer, not as my subject." He left the final words unsaid, letting them hang in the cold morning air. "As my equal." It was everything she had never dared to want. A place where she would not be defined by her role or her rank, but by her own intrinsic worth. He was not offering her a gilded cage. He was offering her a seat at his table, the very table where she had left her challenge. The journey back was a strange dream. They walked together, his great stallion trailing behind them like a patient guardian. The world was hushed and white. The only sounds the crunch of their boots in the snow and the soft snort of the horse. The tension between them had not vanished, but it had transformed. It was no longer the sharp antagonistic friction of their first encounter, but a low, magnetic hum of awareness. They spoke little, but the silence was no longer a weapon. It was a space they shared, a language they both understood. He would point out a hawk circling high above, and she would name the exact species. She would find the tracks of a snow hare, and he would know its path to its burrow. They moved through the wilderness in a synchronized rhythm, two predators who recognized each other's strengths. One afternoon, they came to a ravine spanned by a single ice-slicked log. He crossed first, then turned and held out a hand to her. She hesitated for only a second before placing her hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and sure. His palm was calloused, the hand of a warrior and a king, but his hold was careful. He guided her across, and when they reached the other side, he did not immediately let go. They stood for a moment, hand in hand, the silence of the forest all around them. He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face. In his eyes, she saw a stark and simple truth. He was as lost as she was, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel the urge to run. She felt anchored. When the gray stone towers of his keep finally rose above the tree line, her steps faltered. Returning felt more final, more irreversible than leaving ever had. The people in the courtyard stopped and stared as they entered the gates. The king, who had ridden out alone in a cold fury, was returning on foot, walking beside the Omega healer who had vanished. They were not touching, but the space between them was charged, a visible force field that warned everyone else away. No one knew what to make of it. She saw the confusion on the faces of his guards, the speculative glances of the pack lords. She felt the weight of their judgment, the old, familiar feeling of being an outsider, an anomaly. But then Kaelin looked at her a quick, steadying glance, and the rest of the world faded away. He did not lead her to the Great Hall. He did not summon his council. He led her back to his private chambers, the place where it had all begun. The room had been cleaned. A new fire blazed in the hearth, chasing the chill from the stones. It felt different now. Not a sick room, not a temporary shelter, but a sanctuary. He walked to the great oak table. From an inner pocket of his tunic, he carefully produced the winterthorn blossom. It was slightly wilted from its journey, but still intact. On the mantelpiece was a small, empty ceramic vase. He took it, went to the water basin, and filled it. Then he returned to the table and gently placed the single, delicate stem into the water. The sound of a flower stem being placed in water, a soft click of ceramic on wood. It was a simple, quiet gesture, an act of preservation, an acceptance, a promise. He did not need to say the words. The flower said it all. I see you. I choose you. Stay, he turned to face her. The table no longer a barrier between them, but a common ground. The last of her defenses crumbled, not with a crash, but with a quiet, sighing release. It was full of everything they had been and everything they were about to become. He said her name, a single word that held the weight of the entire winter, Alara, and she answered with his, a breath of sound that was both a surrender and a victory. Kaelin! The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the world was beginning to thaw. It was not an ending. It was the beginning of a new and far more dangerous silence.